All right, hello everybody. Okay, we're going to discuss the variations of the last movement of Beethoven Opus 109. And so you are going to be responsible to talk about variations 2, 3, 5, and 6 on the final. And so we're going to base the discussion on this handout that is on the website, handout for Opus 109, third movement. And in the previous video, I talked a little bit about the theme itself. You know, how many phrases? So there are 4 phrases in the theme, and that the song form is extended 2-part song form. So there are 2 phrases in the first 8 measures, and the first phrase cadences on a half cadence, as does the second phrase, and then that's repeated. It's a good idea to, have another page opened so that if you need to refer back to the theme, you can. And remember that we're using this Schenker edition off of MSlip for Opus 109, Movement 3. So this starts on page 565 of that MSlip score. So the only modulation that occurs in the theme happens in the third phrase, and at that point it goes to G sharp minor and cadences there in measure 12 on G sharp minor there. So that is a shifted authentic cadence in G sharp minor. So the cadence chord is on the third beat, and then immediately it's back into E major for the final phrase. So the theme itself is very, simple and direct. And I talked about the harmony on the downbeat of measure 8. So there is a German 6th chord there. So when you get to that, you're going to hear in measure 7 this. So it's that harmony where you have the subito piano that you hear the German 6th chord, and then sometimes then he is going to, for this last question, enharmonically spell that German 6th chord, and it is the A sharp that he spells as a B flat, which makes it into a C7, C, E, G, B flat. So you should be able to name the pitches of the German 6th chord, which is going to be A sharp, C natural, and you're going to have the C natural in the bass, and then E and G natural. So when the A sharp then is spelled as B flat, that rearranges then from root to 7th being C natural, E, G natural, B flat, so a C7, and that then should resolve to F major, which is the Neapolitan harmony. So that would be the answer to that question if I asked you, how does that enharmonic spelling of the German 6th chord function? And you would answer, well, it functions as a 5/7 of Neapolitan. So the melodic unit, as I mentioned in the previous video, that the opening is constructed of, is that falling third that you hear at the very beginning. So the first couple of intervals. So you hear that falling third. So that's an important motivic idea that we're going to talk about, you're going to look for. And then the melodic unit that he uses to begin the third and fourth phrases. So beginning in measure 8, into the first half, German sixth chord. You're going to hear that repeated note. So that is one thing that you're going to listen for in these, especially the second half of the variations. And also at the beginning of the fourth phrase, when he gives you so you hear that repeated note again at that point. So I want you to discuss the use of these motives throughout the movement. And the bass line at the beginning is something, too, that you can look for because it's present in, we're going to see it actually in the second variation in just a moment. So, but you can look for that. And then the basic idea, of course, with theme and variation is just to discuss, what is the same or similar, and then what is different than the theme. So I want you to be able to then describe the harmonic structure of each variation, how it relates, basically, and it's just a general kind of relationship, but, basically, you're having, different chords sounding on each quarter note. So, talk through that in the previous video. And then you should also be able to talk about, the phrasing, how many phrases are there. So there are 4 in total with the presentation of the theme. Motivic connections, I mentioned the texture. And so, for instance, I mentioned this first variation is homophonic texture. But there are some that are going to use counterpoint. So that's one thing that we're going to point out here in a minute. Then rhythmic comparisons. So one of the things has to do with just the time element of the tempi. And you're going to hear some tempo changes that are very abrupt and definitely take you by surprise. And then especially we're going to look at the last variation rhythmically, what Beethoven is working with in the first half of the variation. So that, of course, is something which plays into this element of contrast. You can also obviously see whether or not the variation uses repeat signs, and you want to be looking for the length of the variation in comparison to the theme. So in general, it will be the same. There's just one variation that has an extra phrase in there, and we'll talk about why you have that extra phrase. Okay, so when we get to the second variation then, what we're going to hear is that Beethoven writes this texture where the melody is being played and alternating back and forth between the hands. So this is something that is an example of what's called a compound line. And it's a single note at a time, but it creates the impression of 2 voices that are alternating back and forth. So you have so that's the first 2 measures. And so the texture here is going to continue in that compound line writing, which is a type of monophonic texture. But again, it creates the illusion, of sounding like it's 2 voices because of that alternation back and forth between registers. So it's kind of writing that you'll see in like solo Bach violin works or cello works. And as I said, creates the illusion of multi, 2 voice texture. So we're going to notice that it changes then texture a lot when we get to box 1 in this edition. And that was one thing that I mentioned earlier video, that Schenker, who's the great music theorist, helps you in analyzing this variation. And so when you look at the variation, you see that it does not have double bars and repeats. And so this is the whole variation too, these 2 pages. And it is going to shift back and forth between this compound line writing in the first 8 measures, and then the texture will change to homophonic at box 1. And so you're going to hear so that is working with both the falling third motive and the repeated note idea right there at box 1. And he's then going to sequence that up by step 3 more times. When we get then to where I stopped at box 5, then he goes back to this alternation between the hands. But basically, the left hand has been playing a repeated chord. And, that kind of goes along with that repeated note idea. But at any rate, when you get here, it continues to do that. You had that octave leap there between the first and the third 16th note. But the hands now are set apart. And again, you're going to hear the same basic idea, but it's just going to lead to the end of that first section, and this is the place where you're listening for the German 6th chord. And so the other place, and the first time that we saw the use of the B flat here in measure 7 and then in measure 8, that is a spot that has the enharmonic spelling of the German 6, and it actually does function as a 5/7 of 4. So if I play these last 2 measures here of this, you hear so to go slowly, so there's a C7, and then it's going to go. So right here at that spot, it does resolve to F major for just a moment. But right here, it resolves then down to the B, which is the dominant harmony. And so it only stays just for 3 beats. It just shifts to the Neapolitan key of F major for just a second. It just gives you a harmonic surprise, and it's just something that is unexpected and unique. Just to get back to the idea of what's happening in box 1 through 8, we're alternating back and forth between the hands. So you hear. So you hear that, and this again is something which leads to that German 6th chord. So here in measure box 7, right there you hear the C natural, and then there it's spelled with an A sharp, the middle note there, the first chord on the right hand of box 8. And it resolves. So it is spelled as a German 6 here. He doesn't do the B flat like he did up here. So it's going to be the same story here in the second half of the variation. we're back to this alternating back and forth between the hands like at the beginning for 8 measures. And then we are going to hear then that shift of texture. So and this is leading to, you should know what that cadence is on at the end of the third phrase. So correct answer would be G sharp minor. So it goes to G sharp minor right there on the third beat where the trill is written. So right there, it's G sharp minor. And then it just moves up to E for the trill. And then on the last phrase of this, shifts back to the alternation of the hands, and then that's the way that this variation concludes. So what's happened in this variation is Beethoven has eliminated the use of double bars and repeats, but instead he has written them out. Heinrich Schenker then uses box measure numbers to indicate those measures that are the written out repeat. The result of this is that then the written out repeat is actually another variation within this variation. So the written out repeats serve as a variation within this overall variation. And so he's going to consistently do this in all of those variations that have written out repeats. So that's the answer to that question. Why does Schenker use boxes for certain measure number sections? And then why does he use his regular circles around the measure numbers? Well, it's because in those that have the box measure numbers, that indicates the written out repeat. All right, so the opening of this, you can clearly hear the melody. So you have, this, and then that falling third from G sharp to E, and then you have, again, the F sharp, which goes to, so the theme was, so clearly he's just deconstructed the harmony and presented it one note at a time, and he has the same basic shape of the melody that is included in the figuration there in this compound writing. The left hand, when you hear it at the beginning of the movement, it's this. And so he does the same thing here. He just has and so he's just presenting the note and then an octave higher and then the next note and so forth. So that definitely is based on the bass line. All right, so that falling third idea, it's present there, but you really hear it in the variation, the written out repeat in this. And also the repeated note idea is really worked with there as well, falling third and so forth. So you see that as something that is used consistently. And then this one doesn't have lots of contrast as far as just the dynamic levels. Teneramente is something that's very tender, and you have some crescendos as things rise to the highest pitch, but you don't really have any places in this where it gets to forte. And it's something that has a real kind of magical sound to it. So we're going to listen to Barenboim play this, and then we'll talk about variation. I think what I'm going to do is play variation 2, and then it's going to lead right into variation 3, and you'll get a sense of the contrast of tempo between those two.